Welcome back, everyone. In the last video, we learned about how we could migrate our user context code into Redux. In this video, we're going to do the same thing with our categories context. And along the way, we're going to learn a couple nuances about how the flow of data in Redux might change the way that we actually think about the logic in how we store our state. So with our categories context, we just want to migrate exactly what we see over into Redux first. So to begin with, we know we need to make a couple files in our store folder. So I'm going to make a new one called categories. And inside of this categories, we will need, of course, a category reducer.js. I also need a category.action.js. We also know we need a category.types.js. And finally, we know we need a category.selector.js. So I'm just setting up these files because we know we're going to need them later. So let's start coding out our reducer. What we know we need is we need the initial state. So categories initial state, which is going to be an object. And inside, it will contain our categories map. So nothing different here from what we have in our context as the value. And then, of course, as we know, we need our categories reducer, which will be equal to a function that receives the state, which by default is equal to categories initial state. And then we get an action. Off the action, we want to destructure off the type and the payload, which will be equal to the action. And we also want to make sure that our action, if no action is passed and for some reason our reducer runs, by default we pass an empty object just so that there's something to call. And then we write our stitch statement on our type. So a lot of this, again, is just going to be very basic boilerplate code that you write with every reducer. It's also good to get this practice when you're typing this out so you remember every single step. And we probably will want to set categories map once we get it from wherever we get it from. So we'll figure out what the types are after. We know that we want to return something with our default state. And we also know that we want to update the categories map with our payload. So structurally, this makes perfect sense. We haven't even written our action creator yet, but we pretty much know that this is what it's going to be. And then, of course, by default, we return the state. So now that we have our reducer, we can, of course, figure out if we need to tweak this later. But we got to take this reducer and we want to put it into our root reducer. So we want to import our categories reducer from categories, category reducer, and then add it to categories on the root reducer. So now that we have our categories reducer, what we want to do is we want to create an action that will update this category, just like we did with our user action. So I'm going to copy over create action from this user action file so that I can paste it in without having to do it myself. And I know that what I need to do is create a set categories map action. And this is going to get a categories map. And then what I'm going to return is call create action with that type that our reducer is expecting. So here I can take this string and I'm going to make the new category type for this. So I want to say const categories action type is equal to an object where set categories map points to categories map the string. If I want it to be a little bit more explicit, I can even say that this is a category / set categories map. This way, when I look at this, I know that the first term tells me which section of my store this is governed by. So similarly, I can do the same thing with user types as well. I can say user / set current user. Just in case you ever come across a time where you have these action type names that kind of seem similar to your other reducers. You can imagine that at an app at scale where you might have 50 reducers, this might get a little bit more clear in order for us to set this up. But now that we have our category action types, we need to make sure that we export this out so that we can import it into the appropriate places. So importing our action types from category types, and we'll need the same thing inside of our action. And then here for the create action, I'm creating set categories map and passing the categories map. And of course, we can't forget to export this out as our action creator. So we have our action creator, we have our reducer, we've connected our reducer. Oh, I also need to remember to actually update the value in the reducer. There we go. So we have our reducer and we have it inside of our root reducer. So now there's nothing actually stopping us from starting to migrate the application. At this point, you have a categories reducer and you also have your category action that will set your reducer with the new categories map payload. So now that we've set up our reducers, I want to challenge you to figure out if you can actually manually now replace the categories context with what we have here. I'm going to give you a hint. What you're going to want to do with this categories context is you need to find a new place for this code. After you're done with figuring out where this code is going to go and what you need to replace accordingly, you're probably going to also need to make sure that you can extract this data from your state. And to do that, you're going to want to use some selectors. So that is my challenge to you. I want you to figure that out. And what you can do, in fact, if you figure it out, is you can even delete the categories context. Here, we've actually done everything we need to with moving the user context over. So in fact, if we look for our user provider, we only have it referenced inside of our user context. And if we look for user context, we also see it's only referenced in the user context file. So nothing is stopping us from deleting this user context.jsx. And that's because we fully migrated. So that's my challenge to you. I've helped you set up a lot of our initial boilerplate for the reducer. Now my challenge to you is to figure out if you can actually leverage this in code and try it yourself. In the next video, we will tackle this together.